Hello. Today we are talking about the transition from the Hellenic age to the Hellenistic period. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about Alexander the Great, his legacy, and what is the Hellenistic period. Last time we left off talking about the giants of Greek philosophy. Socrates was the teacher of Plato, Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, and Aristotle was the teacher of the subject of the first part of this lecture, Alexander the Great. It was Alexander who commissioned portraits of Aristotle. Talking about Alexander the Great brings up a perennial question for historians, and that is, how much does any one individual matter in shaping history? When we first started telling history, history was very much the telling of kings and rulers, their reigns, and the passing of one reign to the next. It wasn't really until the late 19th, early 20th century, and more properly in the 20th century, I think we might locate it, was this desire to tell history that wasn't just the story of rulers, that was the history of little people, of everyone else. And people who thought about history and sought to understand what drives change. Because after all, what is history? History is explaining change over time. And whether one saw great people as being the movers of history or little people working in masses or accidentally because of fate, because of gods, because of individual agency being the movers of history, this question of what drives history has animated much of the inquiry that continues around us in the historical field. Alexander the Great is one of these individuals that gives those historians that want to skip over the greatness and really enlarge the role of any one individual in history. Alexander the Great, Alexander gives those people a run for their money, because it seems very much that this individual and his own initiative had much to do with what we see in both his biography and his legacy is quite significant. So historians who insist that the individual is insignificant rarely have a more challenging refutation than Alexander, is how it's been put. So our story starts in northern Greece, in Macedon, and this is a period we've talked about. We talked about classical Greece and how after the Peloponnesian Wars, we see the glorious Athens that we studied in its golden age reduced to even being ruled by 30 tyrants. They ruled Athens for 8 months. They were overthrown. Up in the north, we see a rising power in Macedon. And on this slide, Macedon is the purple area. And the purple area is the territory of Macedon when Philip II came to power. He takes power. He's a high energy ruler. He is a military innovator. His key innovation, and here is a bust of Philip, king of Macedon. So Macedon is a city-state that isn't celebrating a democratic tradition in the way that Athens had, but it has a king. Philip's innovation was improving the phalanx. Now, the phalanx is a mobile military formation that has existed for centuries, since the Archaic age. And what Philip did was he lengthened the spear that each soldier carried, and he shortened the shield. He made their breastplate lighter. And what that did was allowed this mobile formation to be even more deft, agile. It could move better than enemy armies. He also used cavalry and was quite a strategist. And he embarks on some conquests and is quite successful. He conquers much of Greece definitively in this, we'll see this map again, the Battle of Chaeronea in 338. It looks like he takes Corinth. He doesn't succeed in taking Sparta before his death. He was on his way when he was assassinated in 336 BCE by a nobleman at his daughter's wedding. Now, Alexander's mother, Olympias, and here you may have seen the movie Alexander. We have Angelina Jolie playing Alexander's mother, Olympias, Russell Crowe as Alexander, and Val Kilmer with a lot of Hollywood makeup to recreate his damaged eye as King Philip. You can watch the Hollywood version, see the historical errors. I have links in the notes for you here on this slide to reviews. You can see where a graduate student and a professor of history offer their analysis of how this movie does historically. At any rate, when Philip is murdered, his Alexander ends up taking over. His mother was very ambitious for her, and it is said that soon after Philip's murder, Alexander had his father's mother, Philip had married another younger woman than Olympias, Alexander's mother, and Alexander had that woman's uncle killed, and he had encouraged his own mother to kill the wife's infant son, who was his rival for the throne. And Olympias, very ambitious for her son, exceeded her instructions. She, according to one account, roasted both the infant and another daughter on a charcoal brazier, and she forced Cleopatra, the younger wife of the deceased Philip, to hang herself. Olympias, by the way, supposedly slept with snakes. She was also suspected of having administered poisoning drugs to a child of another of Philip's wives. And so she was quite a character. At any rate, young Alexander takes the throne, and not in his own lifetime, but when the Romans came, by the time of the Romans, he is known as Alexander the Great. He had been born in 356 BC, and he rules from 334 to 323. Remember, we're counting backwards here. So it's a pretty short reign of just about a decade, but what an impact he makes. Here is a bust recreation of Alexander. Now, talking about, as historians, we always want to say, what are the sources? What do we know about this guy? Well, apart from a few inscriptions, some fragments, texts written by people that actually knew Alexander, so that primary source in the truest sense of the word, have all been lost. Contemporaries who wrote accounts of his life were several, some of his generals, people that knew him. So there were sources, but those works have been lost. Later works, however, based on them have survived. And in the bottom of this slide here, you see a list of them. There is from the 1st century BCE. So that's still about 2 centuries plus after his death. Diodorus Siculus wrote an account. We have another account by Quintus Curtius Rufus, Arrian, Plutarch, and then a Justin in as late as the 4th century CE. These are kind of the main sources for knowing what we know and the legends and the bits about Alexander's life. Of all of these, Arrian, which was written somewhere between the 1st and 2nd century Common Era, so that's when we already start counting upwards, is considered the most reliable. He relied on Ptolemy and Aristobulus as his sources. You don't need to know any of this, but a kind of a historian's due diligence when we start telling these stories is to try and have some sense of where all this is coming from. At any rate, Alexander's biography, what did he do? Well, after quelling a rebellion in Greece, claiming the throne, quelling a rebellion in Greece, he attacked the Persian Empire, starting in 334. Here is actually a remnant of a mosaic of Alexander on his trusty horse Bucephalus. That is an inset from this larger mosaic called the Alexander mosaic that was from a floor in Pompeii. When that was excavated, it was probably made about 100 BCE, so a little over 2 centuries after his death. It's now in a museum in Naples, Italy, and this is thought to be the Battle of Issus in southern Anatolia, where he is going against and defeating the Achaemenid, or a Persian emperor, Darius III. And so he takes control of Anatolia, and he goes on this world historical campaign. He went so he conquers Greece, then Persia, the Levant. He goes into Egypt, which surrenders without resistance. It goes back through Anatolia, all the way into Central Asia and the area of what's now India. He has some places he needs to fight battles. Some places there was enough discontent against the Persian or Achaemenid overrulers that they didn't have to face all that much resistance. At any rate, Alexander's fortunes turn around when he's taken his men into India. And in the summer of 326 BCE, in the thick of monsoon season, in the bug-infested, humid Indian forests, on the banks of the Hyphasis River, on their way towards the Ganges Valley, his men finally mutinied, according to the account of Arrian. They just wouldn't go any farther. And this says a lot for a soldier who really was loved by his men. His battlefield charisma certainly accounts for so much of his success, his reported generosity towards his soldier. He land and booty he gave off to his soldiers, reportedly leaving himself so little. At one point he was asked, well, what do you have left? And Alexander's famous answer was, my hopes. At any rate, but for all that charisma, for all that his soldiers loved him and followed him across the known world, he couldn't get them to go farther when they got to India in monsoon season. So he was angry, but he had to turn back. He led his troops back to Persepolis, the Persian capital. And in 323, so just a few years later after turning around in India, at the young age of 33, Alexander got sick and he died of fever. And there's a legendary account, or is it legendary? Is it real? But supposedly on his deathbed, they said, who should rule? To whom should the empire go? To the strongest, he might have sort of eked out. But I think that more historians are skeptical of that account than believe in it. But at any rate, that was the life and a life of Alexander. So that's his biography. I want to say a few words about his empire. And just to show you a couple of pictures, here is, he went as far into Afghanistan, where America has also had soldiers. This diagram shows his route there up into Central Asia, down into India. The green here was General McChrystal's route. And here is a picture of the extent of the empire of Alexander the Great. So let's say a few words about how did he rule, and is this even an empire? Historians talk a lot about how to defend empire. In the simplest way, the simplest definition that I might suggest is a ruler or a polity that rules over other types of people that, whether culturally, linguistically, etc., are of different traditions, habits, life ways, and polities, that it involves conquest. Not always, but most typically, and in Alexander's case, it certainly did. So since it was not an enduring political formation, some people suggest that empire isn't really the word to use here. Be that as it may, what did Alexander think he was doing as a ruler, and how did he go about it? His strategies as he went on conquest, and his pretty much his entire career is spent on campaign, but as he went, he encouraged and even insisted on integration with elites. He built Greek infused cities across his conquests. He built 20 towns called Alexandria, 20 Alexandrias. Is it consistent or megalomaniacal, unoriginal? You decide. But there it is. And he also had a quite eclectic approach. So his strategy of rule was generally to keep an area's traditional administrative system in place as he founded these cities of Greeks and Macedonians in conquered territories. He found cities, mostly named Alexandria, as I just said. The most famous Alexandria is that in Egypt that developed into a tremendous center of learning and congress and commerce. It was quite a cultural attraction for the Hellenistic world. And it supposedly people kidnapped Alexander's corpse and brought it to a tomb there to ensure its tourist appeal. Caesar, whom we'll talk about this week, visited the tomb of Alexander the Great. As part of his strategy of rule, Alexander strived for a degree of elite integration. He wanted to create a new ruling class characterized by intermarriage between Macedonian and Persian nobles. He himself married a foreign woman, Roxanne of Bactria, and later a Persian princess. He encouraged his retinue to do so always. He faced a good deal of resistance in this regard. And then thirdly, when I say eclectic approach, Alexander was happy to wear several hats. And did he intend to have some unified rule and it was still in process when his life was cut short? It's hard to know. But in Egypt, for example, he declared he was the son of Osiris. He seems to have really liked the idea. We're told his mother had actually told him that he was not the son of King Philip, but of Zeus. So he had that perhaps in his background. In Persia, he assumed the custom of having his hand kissed, a custom that was very offensive to democratic Greeks. And even though Macedonia had already been a kingship, it was a kingship more in the strain of first among equals than divine right ruler. And so even among his comrades, the appropriation of these Persian habits caused friction. Alexander installed Persians in his military force. He incorporated them at the high ranks of his army leadership retinue. He forced his men to marry Persian women. He stopped short of imposing any religion on his conquered people. That wasn't a place that he went. Now, and in Persia, whereas in Egypt, he called himself a god. Even in Persia, he took on the role of absolute monarch. And to the Greeks, with that democratic legacy, he wasn't entirely successful at this, we might say, but he still kind of wore that hat, presented himself as that commander-in-chief, first among equals in his retinue. So that's a little bit about how Alexander ruled. When he died, what happened? Well, as I said, it was a flash in the pan, and quite quickly, this territory that we might say Alexander's empire dissolves into various independent kingdoms. The most prominent successor states were the Antigonid, which is Greece and Macedonia, the Seleucid, which is really long, takes up a great deal of territory, and the Ptolemaic, Egypt, which lasts until 31 BCE, when Augustus conquers Mark Antony. The Attalid Empire, because it was founded by one of his close successors, is just a little bit in Anatolia. It doesn't last, it doesn't occupy much territory at all. And so those are sort of the successor states. So no one empire lasts that long, but what does come in its place? Before, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but I want to just say a couple more, close out saying a couple things about Alexander. He's become the stuff of legend. And the sources agree on that. After that, there's quite a bit that's debated. As I've just suggested, what were his intentions? What was his vision of rulership? And it's hard to know entirely because he died so young, even having accomplished so much. But what was his ultimate vision? Did he want to create a kind of new integrated pan-Eurasian identity, or what? We don't. Historians talk about it a lot. It's a fascinating area of inquiry. Another question, Alexander had a lifelong friend, Hephaestion, and people debate about that relationship. If you read the review by Professor Borza that I posted above, you'll see that he says, people really waste a little bit too much time worrying about Alexander's sex life and even asking the question, was he a homosexual or not? Why? Because labels like sexual don't apply. That homosexuality or being gay wasn't an essential identity in this world as much as it was a function of age, of station. And in Athens, for example, same-sex relations happened between men, and it was culturally acceptable that it was often along an age differential. Whereas in Sparta, same-sex relations might happen between men of the same station and age more often. So it seems quite likely that Alexander may well have had sexual relations with Hephaestion, with whom he was a lifelong friend and quite close. He also had wives. You can read Borza's review in the slide above to get a little more perspective on that. Now, so what happened after Alexander? After Antigonus formed the Antigonid kingdom, Seleucus formed the Seleucid kingdom, and Ptolemy took Egypt, which becomes known as the Ptolemaic kingdom, and then ruled for various peoples. And these successor states, as your textbook tells you, some of the what was characteristic about them? Well, your textbook tells you they developed courts where they tried to gather talent and artists and other types of people that would produce literature and art and sculpture and have good advisors. One of the ways they also charged taxes, and a lot of taxes. A way of rulership was to kind of collect more resources from the people, and that may have been something that contributed to the increasing wealth stratification of this period. This period gets called the Hellenistic age. We think of the Hellenistic age from the death of Alexander to the rise of Augustus. So, leave it to historians to call anything an in-between time. It probably didn't feel that way to the people living in it, but there you have it. Those are sort of the bookends of what we call the Hellenistic age. And when we think about the Hellenistic age, we're thinking, if I had one word to pass on to you, it would be contact. That Alexander's empire, his enterprise, is a flash in the pan, but it does lead to lasting contacts. And that has a lot of cultural consequences as well. I have this list, cosmopolitanism, vibrant exchange, coin, the return of kinship, more wealth stratification, increasing privatization, patronage, sculpture, philosophies like Epicureanism, Stoicism, cynicism, religion, and mystery cults. All right, that's a lot. I want to spend the rest of the time breaking it down a little bit. And I want to break it down into these different categories for you, but acknowledge at the outset that sometimes some of these features that I'll talk about, such as privatization, might fall under more than one category. Is it political? Is it economic? And I invite you to think about those things. And on an essay question, you may well be asked to slot developments in these particular categories. And I'll give you a hint. In history, you can get away with a lot. That is, you can have an interpretation that is your own, but what we want to see is that you own it, and that you know what you're talking about, that you have reasons for why you might slot cosmopolitanism as an economic instead of cultural feature, or if it's a bit of both, right? One of the things we're trying to do here in this liberal arts education, in addition to learn real history, is to have greater felicity and ownership of the ways in which we think. And yes, that means at some level, slotting things into categories that we can recognize and support and defend, probe and be skeptical about. And so keep that in mind as I kind of go through these slides with political, economic, cultural. Do they really fit in those categories? Maybe yes, maybe no. And I invite you to kind of think about that. All right, with that sort of those general tips about thinking, what do I mean? Talking about political features of the Hellenistic age. We see a return to kinship. So in places that had, in the Greek peninsula especially, and people that had come from more democratic traditions, we start to see more monarchies, more kinship, this abandonment of commitments to a participatory government, participatory institutions, to this idea of the king is the person in charge. Along with that, we see increasing privatization. Kings, how do they maintain power? Not that they've convinced the Senate or some deliberative body to support their initiatives, but that they have individuals that have wealth and that support them, and that they know that between the wealthy people and even having an army, they can advance their will that way. And that's what we mean by patronage. We'll talk about patronage more when we talk about Rome. In economic terms, this age is one of vibrant exchange, both economic and cultural. One of the things Alexander did was he found all these mines and he minted a bunch of money, and he just unleashed it in his territories. And in the immediate term, it did good. It also brought 75 years of inflation, but it also helped facilitate exchange. It helped people move from barter as a means of exchange. That means you get one good and give you another good. I give you some cloth, you give me a sack of raisins, to giving money for things. And money turns out to be a lot more efficient than actually moving bulky stuff in terms of facilitating trade. So that even with the inflation it brought, it helped facilitate trade. And we see a lot of that across, stretching thousands of miles. Amidst this, we see the development of a language called coin. It isn't coin, but coin. That as merchants come, Greek merchants and their goods that had been penetrating Southwest Asia and Egypt for years, and the Hellenistic empires magnify that process. And what we start to have is a simplified Greek language that gets called coin, becomes the language of commerce, the language of urban areas. We might think of the way that French in the late 18th, 19th century becomes the lingua franca, or English today is sort of the global language. Computers, air traffic control, they speak English, or computers don't speak English, but there are computer programmers, pretty much there's a vocabulary that's in one language, it's English. Air traffic control the world over happens in English. Another example might be the language Kiswahili. Kenya has two official languages, English and Kiswahili. And for many of these people, it is no one's first language. Everyone has their native language. There's 42 something different tribes in Kenya. But in order to get by and talk to each other, people talk to each other in Kiswahili, or in some cases, English. And so it's nobody's first language, but a language everybody knows. And there's a lot of words, for example, words like tea, coffee, ananas, which means pineapple, that sound the same. It's almost the world over. And that's kind of indicative of this world trade. When you bring a new object to an area, since you don't have that object already, what do? You say, what is that called? And that thing that the bringer calls it is the word it becomes. That's a different phenomenon than coin per se. But so the point I'm making here is that this simplified Greek language coin spreads across this Hellenistic world, even if it's under different kings and it's very far apart. And some of the very early Gospels too were written in coin. So again, is this cultural or is this economic? It's a bit of both. So merchants, bureaucrats, soldiers are bringing throughout this world a Greek lifestyle with them. Their language, their dress, their manners, what they know of Greek philosophy and art spreads across this Afro-Eurasian heartland. And as the historian, the late Jerry Bentley put it, he wrote, quote, Alexander had shattered national and ethnic boundaries. As traders, soldiers, administrators, slaves, and other travelers moved from one part of the Hellenistic world to another, they naturally carried their beliefs, values, and faiths along with them, end quote. And here we are talking about things, values, beliefs, faiths, hard to categorize and put our finger on. We can't count them like we can count coin hoards from archaeological digs we dig up, but we still, as historians, have a sense that these are really, really important aspects. So what emerges is a type of cosmopolitanism as all these diverse people interact. And Hellenization is not so much becoming Greek as elements of Greek culture spreading through the region and blurring the boundaries between what's Greek, what's not Greek. Other changes along with that, as we're talking about culture, and they're also economic, how wealth, goods, and services are distributed in a society. These are economic matters. And they also are very much linked to political matters. Political power is largely enacted in courts. And the courts, not meaning courts of judges, but a princely court, a kingly court, where people come together to see and be seen, to ask favors, to build relationships and rapport and make deals and do diplomacy. A court in that sense. These are locations of political power, and they're also places of intense cultural efflorescence, especially as we see courts, the political courts in this world, becoming more privatized and different rulers competing to attract the best talent, the best sculptors, to have the best singers at your court, that the entertainment is the most pleasant and the smartest people are there, and the most beautiful artwork is being produced. So they want to fund those people as well. And one of the ways in which they fund it is by, if they're not winning booty in battle, taxing their subjects. In this period, we start to see a greater emphasis on private life. If in Athens, the good citizen that had an extra chunk of change would give money to construct a public space before, say, remodeling his own courtyard, that Greek homes were fairly simple interiors, and we have these beautiful public spaces where people came together and civic life was enacted. Well, in the Hellenistic age, with this return to a kingship and private courts, we see that money being spent inward. The courtyards become elaborate and beautiful, but not just anyone can get in. You have to be elite. You have to be in the right crowd, have an invitation to get into this court. There's more wealth, there's more concentrated wealth, there's more royal patronage. So those are a few words. Let me say a few words and show you some pictures here about culture. That it's cosmopolitanism, and then in sculpture, one thing that art historians have really helped us understand is that there's a more emotional, more realistic vibe running through a lot of this artwork. Let me show you some pictures. If here is a Greek sculpture, very staid, beautiful, the human anatomy beautifully rendered. Here is what's considered a picture of Hellenistic art. And we see it's less calm, more wrinkles, more emotion. Here's another example. Here on the left, a statue, again, the human form, beautifully rendered, the musculature, impressive, with a sort of calmness about it. Here, Laocoon and his sons counted as and even a bit later, but really representative of the Hellenistic emotional sculpture. We see a lot more action, a lot more emotion, the human body no less beautifully rendered, but more dynamic. Here's some pictures of an old woman and Zeno, the philosopher, founding philosopher of Stoicism, and you see a good deal of emotion. We see wrinkles in their faces, not an idealized kind of eternal youth of a statue, that it was worth sculpting the face lined over the years of an old woman here. Here's an emotional rendering of Cupid and Psyche, second century Common Era Roman copy of a Greek original, so Greek, but done in what we call the Hellenistic age. And then here is one of the most famous examples of Hellenistic sculpture, Nike of Samothrace. And this, we're not entirely sure when it was sculpted, and I have a link here. You can watch a 3 to 4 minute video about it, but you see in this sculpture, which may well have been posed at kind of on a windy shore, and you can almost just feel the air coming in and moving. Even though this sculpture is of stone, you can feel the movement in it, and it's quite typical of the dynamism, the emotion that art historians find characteristic of Hellenistic art. We also, in the Hellenistic age, and I'm not going to give these subjects their due right now, except to just in a galloping way point them out to you, but we see philosophical, new philosophies emerging. Epicureanism is associated with Epicurus, and it's a philosophy that strives for a life of true pleasure. And pleasure in their definitions didn't just mean partying, so to speak, but it meant an absence of disturbance. This is a philosophy that admits women, it admits slaves. There's a sort of implied isolationism in it. In its what does it take to achieve true pleasure, which was a contrast to the ethos of public service ethos in Greek society. I'll say just a few words about all of these, and I think you'll see as we move along the course and watch momentous cultural and religious developments, how these ways of thinking, as they evolve and change, certain threads are with us throughout. Another philosophy that I'll mention is Stoicism, associated with the founder Zeno, whose bust you just saw. And here's a philosophy, it believes in fate. So in that sense of, Greek, for all our rational thought, we can go to the oracle, visit the deity, and find out what's going to happen. It believes in fate, but it also believes in pursuing excellence, which for them, very much along the lines of Aristotle, means pursuing virtue by cultivating good sense, justice, courage, and temperance. That yes, there is fate, but it's important to be almost calm in the face of fate, strive for excellence, and pursue virtue, to strive to be in harmony with the divine, understood in Stoic philosophy to be a rational force of universal nature. Another philosophy emerging is cynicism. We won't say a lot of that, but in this kind of 4th, 3rd century rendition was this notion that if it's natural, it's good. So these people, Diogenes is one of the most famous cynics, who would even go so far as to, defecate in public. This is natural, it's a good thing. From that brief comment, you can see that the way cynicism is a word that we use today, and its meaning has morphed a bit. But at any rate, so these are some of the philosophies circulating in the Hellenistic age. Mystery cults are also developing. We'll talk more about them when we talk about Rome as sort of being contemporaneous with the Christianity emerging. But what I'll say about mystery cults is they're mystery cult, a non-regional cult that starts to see itself as universal. And here this makes sense a bit. If before there were local gods, in this city, this god reigns, this particular city-state, all the way back to Mesopotamia, this town has this god, this town has another god. In a cosmopolitan world where people travel a lot, doesn't it make sense that people would start to take their gods with them and encounter people who might learn from them and say, hey, I like that god. Let me, give a tribute or whatnot. I'm simplifying somewhat, but we start to see in this period mystery cults emerge, and one of the features of them is that they're more universal. They're not specifically attached to a locality, and we see how this sort of cracks open the door for a universal monotheism, which is going to shape our world big time. I'm talking about Christianity, I'm talking about Islam. Zoroastrianism is already in the mix from the Persian world, but we start to see how this way of understanding the metaphysical and the divine starts to gain appeal. Let's see. So here's just a little bit of a recap of a list, and I want to end by saying there are some real limits to Hellenization. Make no mistake, for all this cosmopolitanism, the benefits of it are in large part among elites, although slaves are being moved long distances as well. And also for all this mixing, Jews are not everywhere and always persecuted, but also undergo a good amount of persecution. Your book talks about their persecution under the Seleucids. You can read the story of the book of Maccabees. And so there can be a tendency to talk about the Hellenistic age in with a very rosy sheen. It's an early era of globalization. Is it? Well, it depends on what we mean by globalization, and that's another big conversation to have. But I want to put this, put this slide up here too, to have a perspective on some of the limits of Hellenization and exchange and the cosmopolitanism of this Hellenistic world. And with that, we will end.